Okay, it's Mr. Foster here. We're going to be talking today about constructed response questions, otherwise known as a CRQ. Okay, and that's the second part on the Regents with regards to writing. So you will have two question sets for the part two, two documents with three questions, and then another document set of two documents with three questions. So the first question is always going to ask you the same thing. It's either going to be historical or geographic context. So we're going to take a look at what that means. But the first question is always going to be asking you about what is the historical context or what is the geographic context behind the document that you are looking at in the document set. Now, historical and geographic context are similar in their meaning, but you're just looking at the historical circumstances versus the geographic ones, depending on what they ask you. So historical context refers to the historical circumstances that led to the event or idea in its historical development. So rule of thumb is this. If you have a unit, like let's say we're talking about Industrial Revolution, or we're talking about World War I. Let's go with that. That's an easy example to look at, right? So we got World War I as our example, okay? They're asking historical context. How do we get to World War I? So I'm going to tell you that basically it was imperialism and the competition over resources that led countries to become pulled into these competitions or rivalries that ultimately led to war. When we study these units, the unit that we study previous to World War I is imperialism, okay? Now, it pretty much covers what I just spoke about as far as the competition over resources. Now, imperialism leads us to World War I, okay? So typically, when we're looking at historical context, we look to the previous unit. So if we're looking at World War I, well, what did we study previous to that? Imperialism. Okay, so imperialism is what brings us to what is going on in World War I. And World War I is what brings us to what is going on in between the wars. And the in between the wars period is what brings us to World War II, and so on and so forth. So when we practice this in class, we're going to cover this more. And as you study the different units, you'll see how they're chronological, meaning they go in time order. And typically, the one before whatever unit it is you believe the document comes from is the historical context. So in this case, I would explain how imperialism led to competition over resources, the creation of colonies, the mass production of weapons and military technology on behalf of the Europeans who were competing over the colonies. And ultimately, that led us to World War I. So if our document was a World War I document, we would use imperialism to explain the historical context that led us to World War I. Next, we're going to take a look at the geographic context, right? So geographic context is going to be how we got to the situation described in the document, but we're looking at the geographical elements, okay? How does geography impact, the context of the document that we're looking at? So let's use an example of Japan, from the world of 1750, right? So we know that Japan is isolated. It's hard to write here. Jeez. All right, so isolated. They're very isolated. So we have a document that talks about Japan's isolation as an example, okay? If we were asked to explain the geographic context, we would need to explain something like, well, Japan became very isolated because it was an island, which meant they could really regulate who was coming and going. It also, is far off in the east, so it wasn't on the typical trading routes of Europeans, which further added to its isolation. And these are the elements of geography that caused Japan to be isolated. So if our document was about how Japan is isolated, we would need to explain the geographic reasoning of why that document's talking about what it's talking about. In this case, Japan is an island. Right? Japan's an island, and that's generally the gist of it, right? Because they're an island, they can be isolated. Whereas, an example like China, where there's ways to get into China, many ways over land, it's much more hard for them to be isolated because they can't restrict the movement of people as easily. So again, the first question for the first document is always going to ask you either about historical context or geographic context. Okay, it's going to be one of those two. And it's always the same question. The thing that changes is the document itself. Moving on to part 2 of the constructor response questions, right? You're going to have a second document, and the questions are going to be one of these 4. Okay, so just like the first question, it's always the same. It's always the same with question 2, but they're going to ask you about one of 4 things. And the 4 things are written right here, okay? They're going to ask you about bias, point of view, audience, or purpose. So we're going to go through each of those quickly so you have an understanding of what each of them mean in the context of the CRQ. When analyzing the second document where we're looking at bias, point of view, audience, or purpose, it's important that we identify what kind of document we're looking at, right? Is it a primary source or is it a secondary source? Okay, and I'm going to let you guys take a look at these definitions here, pause the video if necessary to take a look at what each of these sources are. Okay, but generally speaking, primary sources come from history, secondary sources come from present time and are written about history. Okay, and there's a number of examples there that they talk about. The first example for the question, the second document with the question is bias. They may ask you, how is the document biased, right? And what that refers to is a one-sidedness, okay? The example I used in class was if you have a speech by Hitler talking about how Jews are really, really bad. Now, we know the reality of that is not true, and we know that Hitler really hated Jews. He was biased against them. So what that means is when we're listening to his speech and he's talking about how bad Jews are, we have to remember that, oh, he's biased. So is his opinion very reliable or accurate? Not so sure, right? He might be saying things that aren't true because he's trying to convince you of something, right? Because of his bias, right? So he's not going to show you the other side about how Jews aren't bad. He's only going to show you the side that he wants you to see, which is that Jews are bad. And that's the side he is going to present because he's biased. Next, we have point of view. So in this case, you're looking at the point of view, but it's different from English, okay? In English, it's first person, second person, third person. In social studies, we're really taking a look at who the person is, right? What is their viewpoint? Because if we can identify the point of view, for example, with Hitler, we can identify that it's Hitler's point of view. Well, we know a lot of things about his point of view. So now we can make judgments about whether or not he's biased, right? So with point of view, it's basically who is saying it, and what is their background? What are their biases? What are their, their values that might impact how they view something? Okay. Next, we have audience, and audience is who they're talking to. So in the example going back to Hitler, right? If he's giving a speech, who is he giving it to? Well, typically when we give a speech, we give it to large groups of people, right? So his audience would be the German people. If he wrote a letter from himself to another specific person, well, the audience would be that specific person. So we look to the document to figure these things out. And we're going to cover that in a minute. The last one is purpose. Okay, why are they doing this? So in the example with the speech, Hitler gives a speech to the German people, and in the speech, he talks about how Jews are bad. Well, what's the purpose of his speech? The purpose of his speech is he's trying to convince you of something, right? In this case, that Jews are bad. So he's going to say his speech and talk about how they're bad and be biased and have his speech really reflect his own point of view for the purpose of convincing the German people of what he wants them to believe, right? In this case, that Jews are bad, and that would be Hitler's point of view for that. Now, all of these different categories for the second document, right? Purpose, audience, point of view, and bias, they give us this graphic organizer to help us think about these things, but they all refer to reliability. So when we're talking about a speech by Hitler, and he's talking about how Jews caused all the problems in the world, okay? And we know he's biased. We know his point of view is biased, right? And let's use this speech example. So his audience is the German people. When we're assessing whether or not his opinion is authentic, unbiased, objective, we think about it on a spectrum. Because in reality, it's not like they're just going to say things that are completely unreliable. It may be somewhat reliable, right? So let me give you an example. If he says that Jews are the cause all the problems in the world, well, in reality, that's really not true. And we know that he's super biased. So we can consider his account to be pretty unreliable in that case. If he says that Jews you know, cause all the problems, and he relates it to specific evidence, right? We may be able to consider his opinion somewhat reliable. Let's say we have a textbook, right? That's just, its purpose is informational. It's trying to get information out there. It doesn't have a biased point of view. It's not trying to convince you of something. So we would consider information in a textbook to be much more reliable than a firsthand account of somebody who may be very biased in a particular situation. Okay, so that's something just to consider. The last thing to address here for the second document, like the question 2, is looking at sourcing, content, and context. Whenever you get a document, you're going to get something called context, all right? It's going to be a little blurb that's at the top. It's going to give you some information, okay? Not all information. The document's really going to provide you with most of it, but it's going to give you an overview. So in this case, it says that Charles Turner, I can't read this, too small, Richard Osler were leading supporters of the British factory reform. Okay, so this document I know is going to be related to British factory reform. Okay, then you have the content of the document, right? What the document actually is. And then at the bottom, very important for our second question, is sourcing. Okay, this is where you're going to look to see, like, okay, is this a primary source? Is it a secondary source? Who's the audience? What's the purpose of this, right? In this case, it says source is from George Rosen. It's a book, Charles Turner, Thakra and the Agitation of the Factory Reform, British Journal of Industrial Medicine. Now, it doesn't have a year there, but I believe this is more of a secondary source, something that is written about the past. Usually you will see a year there. So if you see like 2004 and they're talking about the factory system, which happened, starting in the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, we know that this is a secondary source. Okay. Additionally, quotations, as you see here, signal to us that this is a book, right? If you had something that's a letter, it might say an excerpt from a letter written to whoever, and it will say that there. So these are the cues that we look for to determine whether, what the audience is, what the purpose is, who wrote it, when it was written, is it a primary or a secondary source? So you really want to make sure you look at the sourcing for each document as you're analyzing them. Now, the third question in the document set is always going to ask you to do something with the first two documents, right? So you're going to use the two documents to respond to a prompt. And these also are going to be set, meaning there's only a few options they're going to ask you about. But you will always have to use both documents in your response, okay? Now, as it says here, the three types of questions that they could ask you are going to be cause effect, turning point, and similarity or difference. And we're going to take a look at that right now. So the first question prompt could be, I want to do cause effect, sorry. So the first question prompt is going to be cause effect. Out of the two document sets that you get, you will always have a cause effect, okay, always. The first one will always be cause effect. The second one can either be one of those three options we just looked at, okay? Now, a cause refers to something that contributes to the occurrence of an event, the rise of an idea, or the bringing about of a development, okay? The effect refers to what happens as a consequence, as a result, or as an impact. So if I have two documents, let's say I have one document talking about World War I technology, and I have another document that talks about how many people died during World War I. Well, I would say in this case that the technology is what caused the death, right? So if I have documents that talk about the new technology during World War I, and then another document talks about the death toll, that's the connection I'm going to make. Right? That the technology that they developed led to the higher death toll. Also, you should note that you need to use both documents and you need to cite textual evidence, meaning you need to find evidence from the documents and state that, meaning quotes or specific data from a table or from a graph that you're going to use to make your argument, right? So I would want to find textual evidence within my document that supports this idea as I write about it. The second type of question you will see for the third question of the document set is known as a turning point, okay? And what this basically is How did things change? How is the documents represent a turning point? Okay. It's a major event, idea, or historical development that brings about significant change. It can be local, regional, national, or global. So if you have a set of documents that shows French Revolution, for example, before the French Revolution, we had absolute monarchies, right? So if we had a document about the monarchies, and then we had another document about the democratic government that was established after the French Revolution, well, in this case, those documents represent a turning point, right? So you might say, hey, the French Revolution, based on these two documents, represents a turning point because before they had an absolute monarchy and after they had a democracy. And note, again, you need to use evidence from both documents. So you're going to want to cite textual evidence to support your claim that these documents are a turning point of some kind. And the last type of question that you're going to get for the question 3 is a comparison. Okay, and what that really means is similarity and differences. Okay, again, you have to use both documents to explain a similarity or a difference. But one thing I want to point out that's very important is that clearly identify a similarity or a difference and explain that similarity or difference using evidence. So you have to use evidence, but you have to explain a similarity. That means one. Okay, so you can say something that's similar or something that is different, and that's okay. Just one. You do not have to do a similarity and a difference. It's just similarity or difference. Okay, so if you see a difference in the documents, talk about that. Make sure you cite your textual evidence. If you see a similarity, talk about that. Make sure you cite textual evidence. Lastly, just to quickly review here, the way the questions will be set up. I mentioned that you're going to have 2 document sets. Now, the first document set will always look like this. You will have the first question that's going to be geographic or historical context. The second question could be point of view, audience, or purpose, or bias. Okay. 2B asks you to assess the reliability for a specific use. So again, you're going to use these ideas about bias, point of view, audience, and purpose to explain why the document is reliable or not reliable. Question 3 is always going to be cause effect for that first document set. Okay, so you always have geographic or historical reasoning for the first question. And the third question is always, for the first document set, going to ask you about cause effect. Now, the second document set is going to have a change for question 3. So they might ask you about a turning point or similarity or difference. Okay, so the first document set, always cause effect. The second document set is either going to have turning point or similarities or differences. But also I will note that the question 1 for all document sets is always the same thing. They give you a document and they say, what's the historical or geographic context? Okay. As is always the case, if you don't understand something, make sure you advocate for yourself and reach out to myself so that I can help you with whatever it is you don't understand. Also keep in mind that this is a great resource to refer back to whenever you're working on a CRQ. When we're doing CRQs, I will try to put support videos in there with the documents themselves, but this is a general overview of CRQs that should be helpful in determining, how you approach the questions. We will get more practice with this in class.